Well, thank you very much. That was a great framing to start the conversation. In addition to working at Protect Democracy, I'm also on the board of CCPL, and one of my most important affiliations is I'm also the godfather to Michael and Melissa's second daughter, which I always want to include in my CCPL bio. Thank you all very much for being a part of this conversation, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. As was mentioned, I'm a policy strategist for free and fair elections at Protect Democracy. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization focused on ensuring that the US does not slide into a more authoritarian form of government. And I think interesting for a conversation like this, we are not a faith-inspired organization. We are a secular organization. So why are we here? Why are we sponsoring CCPL? Why did we want to be a part of this conversation? It's because we understand that in order to defeat authoritarianism, in order to have a democracy, you have to be able to build a broad coalition of people who might have big disagreements on individual policy areas, but who are willing to work together and prioritize the defense of our democracy. And frankly, throughout our history, we've never been able to build that coalition without the leadership of faith communities. And at this pivotal moment, we cannot build that coalition without the leadership of people of faith and the church in particular. So I wanted to just provide that entry point for why Protect Democracy is a part of this conversation and why it's so important to us. And I'd like to introduce our panelists here, starting with Cerin to my right. She also works at Protect Democracy, and she serves as a counsel who works on advocacy and research related to reforms of our electoral system, including reforms related to parties and government institutions. And she also does litigation related to preventing efforts to undermine our elections and the democratic process. And I'll add one more thing from Cerin's bio, because this helps to illustrate really putting into practice the broad coalition that we want to build. When I started my career, I worked at Susan B. Anthony List, which is now Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America. At around the same time, Cerin was working as a healthcare staffer for Senator Barbara Boxer. So if you know Barbara Boxer, you know Susan B. Anthony List. We have very different backgrounds, but we have worked shoulder to shoulder for the past 3 years or so on defending our democracy and preparing to protect the 2024 election, because we want to prioritize the defense of our democracy. And Tammy Patrick, we don't work together anymore, but we both worked at Democracy Fund at the same time. She is now the Director of Programs at the Election Center, which is the National Association of Election Officials. Before that, she worked as a senior advisor to the elections program at Democracy Fund. Ted Johnson and I have not had the opportunity to work together yet, but he works at New America in the executive office and is also leading their flagship US at 250 initiative. And I have to say, he just has a new book out called If We Are Brave. I started reading it on the way down here. I couldn't put it down. I almost missed my stop at the metro because I was enjoying the book so much. I almost missed the transfer and would have had a much longer walk to get here. So I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here, and also remind you that on the app, you can start asking questions at any time. We'll do some introductory questions, and then I guess I have the power to choose which questions we're going to ask. But I'd like to ground the conversation with Tammy, because Tammy is really our expert here on the electoral process and the way our elections run. And so, Tammy, we're in the home stretch of a very contentious election season. We also are now trying to make sure that people can vote even in the midst of enormous natural disasters. And so I wanted to ask you that, with one of the biggest threats to our democracy being the lack of trust in our elections, in part as the result of deliberate efforts to undermine trust in our elections, as citizens and as Christians, how can this group think about engaging in our election system? How can we increase trust in the process during this difficult time?
Well, thank you so much, Chris, and it's lovely to be here. There's a saying that we use in election administration, and I've been working in the election administration space for about 20 years now, and that is trust but verify. And so I started out in elections with a little place called Maricopa County in Arizona. Most people have never heard of it. And I was a federal compliance officer there for over a decade, and elections take an entire community. My first job was hiring 8,000 1,000 poll workers to staff 1,142 polling places. In 2020, we had 132,000 polling places, and many of those were places of worship that opened their doors to their communities. They were private companies that opened their doors, and in some cases, private homes. And we know that we had about 775,000 poll workers. So it's important to realize that our elections are conducted by our communities. And in fact, a third of our election offices in this country don't even have a full-time employee. So I mention this because I think there are some things that we can take on faith, but in other cases like our elections, we should be relying on science, facts, and evidence. And so that's what we need to really turn to, is where do we find the truth? Where do we find information? So the things that we can do is we can advocate for sufficiently funding our elections in this country. One of the first things that gets cut when you have budget cuts, or that never gets implemented to begin with, is communication and outreach to voters so that they understand how their elections work. And I often say that if you know what's right, you can tell what's wrong. So if you know how your elections are conducted, or what voting systems are used, or what your ballot looks like, when you see misinformation online, or somebody's talking about it at the dinner table, you can tell that it's incorrect and you can speak out about it. So we need to make sure that we're sufficiently funding our elections. I'm working on a project, a bipartisan project with the Edward Kennedy Institute and the Bob Dole Institute, because in a recent survey it was shown that for election offices in most counties, their part of the budget is less than 0.5%. So we don't really provide sufficient funding. And we need to, because we need to not only fund it, but we need to pass and implement laws that secure our elections and that allow our citizens to make sure that they understand it. Laws like ballot curing, post-election audits, all the sorts of things that we have in place in many places, but not in all places. And then last of all, the things that you can do is to take on action. So we often say that, democracy is not a spectator sport, and so you want to make sure that not only are you voting, but you're speaking up when you hear people saying things that are just untrue, or that they don't really know, but are making some wild accusations. So make sure that you're in this moment when some of this really hate-filled and aggressive and violent rhetoric gets used, that you speak up. Be a poll worker. Talk about your experiences. Talk about your experiences as a voter. If you've ever had the election office call and say, we're checking on your signature, it was a little funny and it's because you had your arm in a cast, talk about that to people you know, because those are the types of things that engender trust in the system. And when we don't talk about it, there are ramifications. We've had a mass exodus from the profession. In some cases, it's been nationally about 40% of our election officials have left the field since 2020. My friends of decades have had their dogs poisoned, their children followed to school. They have to wear Kevlar vests on their way to work as a city clerk. This is not something I ever thought we would face in the United States of America, and it's going to take all of us to make sure that we, in fact, do turn this around and make sure that we maintain free and fair elections.
Thank you very much, Tammy. I also want to mention on the subject of how we can get involved in ensuring a free and fair election that Protect Democracy is partnering with Interfaith America on a resource called the Faith in Elections Playbook. That's a one-stop shop website that helps people find nonpartisan ways to get involved, such as becoming poll workers, having conversations across difference, meeting with your election officials to learn more about the elections. And so Interfaith America has a table here. Raleigh Olson, who's a wonderful partner to our work, is out there so that you can get the information on the Faith in Elections Playbook, which we are really excited about. Ted, I want to turn to you now. A lot of your writing focuses on race and solidarity and democracy, and I don't think we can have a conversation about trust in our elections and in our democracy without talking about some of the difficult elements of our history around voter suppression and around race. So I was wondering if you could just talk about some of the themes of the book and how we can apply them to our lives and our work in this election season.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And I mean, look, this is the United States of America, which means there's never been an election, a presidential election certainly, where race or civil rights was not on the ballot. Now, sometimes it was the #1 issue, like 1860 and others, and sometimes it took less salience. Maybe in the 20s and 30s, it was sort of, it wasn't the thing that the party sort of oriented their platform around, but it's never not been a problem, or never not been a contentious issue or concern. In election times, especially presidential election cycles, my sense of it is that race gets used in one of two ways. It's either operationalized or it's weaponized, and maybe those are two sides of the same coin, but my work is mostly about black voting behavior, and black voters are often talked about like a chess piece or like a, the card you need to complete the suit or something like that. We got to get black voters, we need those pro-choice people, we need the environmentalists, we need the union folks, and then we can win an election. And then sort of the other way of thinking about black voters or race and civil rights generally is those are the people that we've been trying to tell you about. These are the people that are going to destroy our country, they're going to ruin our way of life, and so we need to guard our democracy from their participation. The story of our democracy is the story of excluded people seeking participation in it. And race and gender, frankly, are the two things, or the two characteristics that have kept people out of our democracy over our nation's history more than any two other things, more than class, more than property, more than any two other things. I think we're seeing things like nation of origin and immigration status becoming a new attack point, so much so that those things get sort of merged into the race conversation. So now we hear about, you need to be careful about those people south of the border because they're, drug dealers and rapists. You need to be concerned about your black neighbors in Ohio because they're eating your cats and dogs. You need to be concerned about your Asian American neighbors because they're bringing COVID to your Walmart, and that needs to be stopped. And so race has either been used to turn us against one another, or it's been used as the people have been integrated into a party system, a political system, in hopes of helping parties win power, but not always delivering on the things that group that has been invited in believes to be most salient. So what I try to pull forward in the book is not just the urgent need for democratic reform of our institutions and our processes, our systems writ large, but the need for a kind of civic and cultural reform where we don't look at our neighbor as the enemy, where we don't demonize people just because they have a different worldview. And unfortunately, one of the characteristics of race generally is that you can see what color I am. You don't know where I stand on abortion or the environment or on energy, but you know where I stand on race more times than not because you see me. And so it's unavoidable. It becomes part of our politics because of the ontology of race, because of the physical, descriptive nature of how race works, which makes it easier to other and also makes it easier to signal those folks are with us because you can clearly see they're part of our coalition. So race alters our political calculus, our electoral outcomes, but I see race as an opportunity to help America become the nation that it can be, that it has the potential to be, but it is the question we must answer if we're ever going to have the full promise of America available to all of us and reach the potential that the country has.
Thank you so much. And that's a great segue to something I wanted to ask Cerin, because you get into identity, and that's one way that people engage in politics that's sometimes undervalued when we try to understand the way people engage in politics. But we also, most of us do care deeply about specific policy areas and specific candidates that we want to get elected. So I wanted to ask you, Cerin, about even as we engage in favor of candidates, in favor of causes, how can we try to engage in a way that also prioritizes defending our institutions, defending our democracy?
I think engaging in the process is actually part of how to do that, and the most important part of how to do that. Democracy is all of us showing up together and not necessarily agreeing. In fact, showing up to disagree, but doing it as part of the democratic process. And I think doing it as part of the democratic process and supporting other people engaging in that process, whether they agree with you or not. It's not just having a campaign event, it's recognizing that someone else protesting that campaign event is part of the process. The important thing is that everybody allows everybody else to participate. You know, democracy is saying, okay, I disagree with you, but you have a right to say what you think. You have a right to vote for the candidate who you think will best represent those views. And then we're going to send those representatives to a state legislature, to a city council, to the United States Congress, to the White House to speak for us and to represent us. And that only works if everybody's allowed to engage in that process. And it feels crazy to sort of say that out loud, but increasingly, there are folks who are using violence as a campaign tool, and that kind of escalation is a danger to the process. And so folks engaging in the process without using violence, you going to a neighbor and saying, hey, that's not appropriate to throw punches. Show up, protest, say your piece, absolutely. But there's a line that we all have to mutually respect in order for this process to work, and showing up and making sure that you're staying on the right side of that line, encouraging other people to stay on the right side of the line is incredibly important for all of this working, not just this year, not just 4 years from now, but a century from now. This is an iterative exercise. We want this country and this democracy to be here not just for our kids and our kids' kids, but for the future generations that we hope to leave a legacy to that's been left to us.
Great. Thank you very much. Tammy, you touched at the start of this on some of the stress and even the danger that our election officials are facing at this moment. And I'm wondering, especially as a group that is both dedicated to lives of prayer and also lives of action, how can we be thinking about supporting our election officials in this moment, thinking both about how we can pray for them and be in solidarity with them, but also concrete actions to help them?
It's such a great question. I think it's important that we all realize that we do have a powerful position and a powerful role to play in this moment. And as I mentioned, it's not a time to sit idly by. So the first and foremost is really to not condone the direction that we're heading with some of the discussion around political violence, and just making sure that we speak up. Sometimes it's difficult. It's far easier in some situations to not say anything, but in this moment, we do all need to speak up and make sure that we are both seeking out the truth, because we don't want to be, lemmings or sheep. We want to make sure that we understand and we're thinking critically about what type of questions should we be asking about our elections and our election officials and how they serve the communities that they're devoted to serving. So we want to ask those questions, but we want to make sure that we are speaking up when we hear people who are benefiting in a variety of ways from misleading voters and the general public. So that's one big thing. The other thing is make sure you have a plan to vote. Chris mentioned the extreme weather that's happening, and that definitely can change people's plans and when and where and how they're going to vote, let alone who they're going to vote for. But many people have had changes. Even outside of extreme weather, there's legislation that's passed in the last few years to change what options you have in voting, where you can vote, when you can vote, how you can vote. So make sure that you're educating yourself, your families, your friends on what those options are, and both in when you're registering, keeping your information current, and others. And so making sure that you have your own plan, you're helping others to understand what those changes might be. And the one really big piece that's happening right now is in the face of some of those changes, and let's be totally honest, some of those changes are being done, as was mentioned, to prevent some people from participating. There are last-minute changes that are being attempted in the courts right now to change things, and voting's already happened. More than is already happening in every single state. We've had more than 1 million people already cast their ballots in this country. And so it's important that we understand that when there are attempts to curtail participation, research has actually shown that it's a bit of a backlash from voters. I refer to it as the tenacity of the American voter. You trying to take away my rights? Oh, really? Really? Let's just see how that's going to work for you. And what's really interesting is that when those attempts are made, not only does it energize and get people engaged, it never has the intended purpose that people think, right? So I was in Arizona when they passed a law called Prop 200, where you have to provide proof of citizenship. and they thought that that was going to make a huge impact on one party over the other. And the truth of the matter is that I had just as many snowbird Republicans showing up in the office that didn't have a birth certificate as I had Democrats or independents, unaffiliated voters. So in this moment, we want to make sure that we are making a plan, we're building on that plan, we're uniting with our neighbors in the midst of, Helene and Milton and what else is going to come down in the next couple of months. We need to remember what we are as a community and as neighbors. And then lastly, being thankful and grateful in this moment. Election officials, we always used to lament about toiling away in obscurity because nobody would come to a logic and accuracy test while we're testing voting equipment. Who wants to watch that paint dry? Because it really is pretty boring. But it's important that those who are doing this work, which is not only in the past thankless, but now they're under attack, figuratively, literally. And so when you go to vote, thank them. When you call in to ask a question, thank the person answering the phone, because the call they just got off of, the person probably wasn't as kind. So I think we just want to emanate what we want to see in the world, and be thankful and grateful that we do live in a country still, at least in November of 2024, where we can exercise these rights.
Thank you very much. And if you're interested in attending a logic and accuracy test and you are local, I'll be bringing some faith leaders on October 17th at 10 a.m. to the Montgomery County, Maryland testing of election equipment, because it is important to show up, let people know that the process is transparent, and report out that we're observing what's happening, trust but verify. So we really do take it seriously to engage in the process and help educate our neighbors. I want to talk a little bit about the post-election period, because I think one thing that's different in the 2024 election versus past elections is with what happened in the post-election period between the election and inauguration in 2020 has revealed to us that there are a lot of steps that happened that used to just happen quietly and rather boringly that now we have to be thinking more about. And Cerin and I were part of a broad coalition working on helping to update the laws that govern the casting of the electoral votes, called the Electoral Count Act, that was put under stress in 2020 and on January 6th. But I wanted to ask you, Cerin, how you're feeling about the post-election process now that we're in at least a little better legal place than in 2021. We've shored some of those things up. But also, how should everyday people be thinking about their role at that time? Because I'm guessing a lot of us will be doom scrolling on social media and feeling helpless at that point in the process. What might we be able to do? Or should we just turn away and focus on Thanksgiving and Christmas?
I mean, first of all, you should absolutely spend the majority of your time focusing on Thanksgiving and Christmas. But as you celebrate, as you break bread, don't check totally out. Please don't check out. Please don't cast your ballot and then check out, because election day doesn't just start now and go through the election. In a lot of ways, it goes through January 20th. And we need everyone to stay checked in to that process as folks reach their certification dates, where we need everybody to certify their elections by December 11th. Check in, make sure your state's getting certified. As the Electoral College gathers on the 17th, check in. Don't maybe check in for that Christmas deadline. Every state is sending a Christmas present to the archivist. We'll let the archivist let us know if they get all their Christmas presents on time. But don't check out, because it's incredibly important that we all stay checked in to make sure that that process, which again, we aspire to make it as boring as possible through January 20th, but it's important to stay checked in to make sure that it's happening, to make sure that people know that you care about it happening in the most regular, boring fashion possible. I think it's also important to note that, I used to work for the Senate for my 20s, and I used to complain about them a lot. My husband is like, say one nice thing about the United States Senate. I was like, every so often, they gather and make things that seem impossible possible, and then do them. And that's also true of the Electoral Count Reform Act. a lot of folks came together who disagree about a ton of stuff, but they agreed that the process needed improvements. And they made them. In the 117th Congress, they came together on a broad bipartisan basis and said, this could use some updating. This process has been in place for a century and a half. It could use some tweaks. And they made them, and it's incredibly important. This is gonna be the first time that the joint session after a presidential election is gathering under those new, revised, improved rules. And it's incredibly important that it happen on a bipartisan basis because these are rules that Congress makes for itself in engaging in the joint session. And so we have some hope that going into that, because there was such broad bipartisan engagement in revising those rules when people came together to make those changes, we hope there's similarly broad bipartisan engagement in folks following those rules in the joint session. January 6th used to be so boring that occasionally they would change the day. If it like landed on a weekend or something, Congress would be like, Saturday is no good for me. And they'd pass a little like one-time law to be like, let's meet on Monday instead. I aspire to January 6th being so boring again someday that you can make those little changes and nobody notices or cared, just like nobody noticed or used to care. But you know, I think the reality is that right now we're in an incredibly dangerous, vulnerable time where we're doing this for the first time, hopefully the first of many for the next century and a half of that new revised system working. But please stay checked in to watch it, get some popcorn, you know, go on Congress Twitter. I promise you there are some parliamentary nerds who would be only too happy to explain to you on Congress Twitter the minutia of all the things that are about to happen under the new procedures. If you have any questions about the new procedures, I too will be only too happy to bore you with the details of them. But the important thing to remember is that we hope for it to be as boring as possible.
And at the risk of being as boring as possible, I do want to make a historic note for why this matters, because I think the historical context is helpful. I was going to skip this, but then this is in Ted's book, so I felt justified in talking about it, is a quick history lesson. So the Electoral Count Act was passed in 1887. It was a result of what happened in the 1872 election. It became very clear that the post-election process did not have a lot of clarity, and that if there were disputes after an election, Congress was not prepared for it, the laws were not clear that were on the books. What ended up happening is Congress, as Congress sometimes does, did nothing to fix the problem. So then when 1876, bless you, when 1876 came around, there was a contested election, and there were not rules of the road for how to decide it. What ended up happening was the compromise was made that Rutherford B. Hayes would become president. And the deal that was struck was that he would pull the troops out of the South and surrender on Reconstruction. So these kind of wonky, nerdy things are actually important. The things that most of us don't have to pay attention to that build our institutions really matter. And we can't make progress on justice more generally if these institutions don't hold. Staying a little bit on that topic, one of my favorite parts of Ted's book so far is he talks about, in a really beautiful way, his mother, and that she was basically a saint, and he writes really beautifully about her. One of the things he mentions is that she never cursed, except on January 6th, 2021. And it's sort of a funny anecdote, but it also helps to show why the importance of that day and why that was such a challenging point. And so Cerin and I have provided a little bit of history, a little bit of the wonkiness of the law, but I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more of some of the historical context and sort of broaden the conversation about why some of this is important, because some people say we should just move on past talking about January 6th, talking about the 2020 election. There are some people that say that and then bring it up a lot, but I'll leave that alone. So what do you want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, it's, I mean, as you said, my mother was the minister of music at our church. We were a family from North Carolina. We were in church 3-4 times a week, and Sunday school, church, Bible study, choir rehearsal, youth night, the whole nine. So, you know, as you said, she didn't curse, but on January 6th, she reaches out, texts me at 3:08 and says, "What the hell?" And at the moment, the Congress, you know, the Capitol was being stormed. My grandmother was born before black people or women could vote in 1918. My mother was born in '52, where ostensibly women could vote unless you were black and in the South, and you still couldn't vote. When my mother turned 18, she couldn't vote because at the time it was 21, and it wasn't until she turned 21 that a new amendment came in that lowered it to 18. So I say all this to say that democracy had always been withheld from my family until my mother had graduated from college. And so on January 6th, the rationale for why the election shouldn't count was because there was fraud in a number of places. Places like Philadelphia, Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee. What is a common denominator of these places? Large black populations. And it wasn't lost on my mother that people stormed the Capitol because black people in metro areas who flipped states, Georgia and Pennsylvania and others, were the reason why Joe Biden is now president. And so she almost took personal offense to January 6th because black people were being blamed for a fraudulent election. And to me, I look at that, politics as usual, this is how it happens. For her, this was the story of her parents, her story, the story of her aunts and siblings, and so on. So she took it very personally. And so this is why democracy is not just the system. It's not just the process. Democracy is also a kind of culture. It has its own identity. If you are American and say, yeah, I'm not sure about democracy, even if you've been oppressed by democracy, you kind of get a side eye like, what are you, a communist or something? Like, what do you think is better than this democracy? So, you know, maybe I'll just sort of, I mean, I could go on forever about the ways that our perceptions and our feelings of belonging in democracy are as important as the laws that protect us, our participation in it. But maybe I'll just wrap up by saying that, and I was talking backstage here, this is part of the nerd stuff, with like a Federalist paper quote, maybe apt for the audience. On Federalist Paper 51, this is the Federalist paper that talks about checks and balances. And one of the quotes in there is, if men were angels, there would be no need for government, you know, because we would be righteous and our principles and all that would be aligned. And if government were run by angels, there would be no need for constraints or for a constitution or these regulations because our leaders would be so moved by moral righteousness and principle that they wouldn't abuse it. Neither of those things are true. And so the reforms that need to happen are about addressing the fact that we don't have angels leading our democracy. But there's another part of this is that we are all not angels. And so there's a civic and cultural, sort of a social component to our democracy that's required. If you have a broken democracy but a very strong and just society, that democracy can function. If you have a very strong, efficient democracy, but people who hate each other, that democracy will fall apart. And so just as important as it is that we reform our institutions and processes and systems, we also must do the personal, interpersonal, intergroup social work of trying to find kinship, solidarity, see our neighbors see ourselves in our neighbors, even if they're completely different from us along a range of factors, if we want this country, if we want this democracy to pan out. And that's not it's not an optional thing. It has to happen, or we will continue to see more. This January 6th was not the first one ever. The violence that election workers are facing now, it's not the first time that's ever happened. We've been in this place before. Other generations have proven capable of overcoming it. Some have proven that they weren't up to the task and allowed it to fester. We have to be the people that reforms it for our time if we want to pass something of value on to posterity.
Such an important point. Thank you very much. We're going to turn to your questions now, and in an effort to be as democratic as we can, I'm also going to try to do it based on the number of upvotes. So whichever one gets the most votes, I'm going to go there. We have a tie for first place. Cerin, legally, what do we do? Just kidding. This is a good one that I'm going to give to Tammy. Which states do the panelists believe allow for the most free and fair elections? What is their process, and how can we get other states to emulate them? And be careful.
And be careful. So it's an excellent question. I will say that when you talk to election officials, they all believe that the elections conducted in their state are sound, they're legitimate, they follow their state's laws, but the laws vary so much. So if we're talking about where, from a voter's perspective, do they have the most options? Do they have the ability to engage with the franchise in a way that meets them where they are? There are, about half the states, a lot of them are out west, where a voter can choose to vote by mail, they can vote early in person, they can go to the polls on election day if they choose. They can receive information in their language of choice so that they can understand the propositions, and does yes mean yes? Or does yes mean no? So when we're talking about places where the elections are free and fair, all across the country, I believe that the outcome of the elections are legitimate. They were legitimate in 2020. I believe they will be legitimate in 2024. And if someone tries to put their finger on the scale or have an outsized influence on the outcome, there are laws in place to address any sort of criminal activity, whether it's fraud or it's the prevention of an eligible voter from participating. And so it's a great question, but it really, there's the answer in elections is always, well, yes, but it's this way, but in this state, there's the anomaly. So I really feel like we should have faith in elections across the country, and that's a big challenge because research shows that most voters are pretty confident with elections in their hometown. They're not so sure across the state because there's those cities or there's that rural place where, who knows what they're doing out there. And when it comes to across the country, that's where confidence falls apart. But it's important to know that all across the country, election professionals conduct the elections. They all raise their hand and take an oath of office. And for decades and centuries, we've had people in those positions with the proper motivations. But in this moment, we know that there could be people who don't have the right motivations, who take that call to try and find votes or try and not certify a legitimate election. And we're going to have those tests. But the checks and balances will hopefully hold. And that's why we can't check out, and we need to make sure that we're paying attention and that those individuals are held accountable if they do that, and that we take away any incentive for anyone to try and have an outsized voice.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you all. Voter turnout on the app is increasing rapidly, and we actually just had a lead change. So I'm gonna ask, and it's changing as I'm reading it. So they just retook the lead. This is what election night might feel like.
Are you Steve Kornacki?
So this is a question about the media and local engaged newspapers and local engagement and a sense of care for place have collapsed. And there's the presumption those things are connected. Democracy is only healthy when it's healthy in thousands of local communities. Should we launch a major initiative to restart local news media, or is that a lost cause? Who wants it?
Oh, you want me to take it? I think I was having a conversation yesterday with somebody about really big long-term electoral reforms, which is something I spend a lot of my time at Protect Democracy working on. And it's the kind of things that people are like, that's crazy, that'll never happen. And you're like, okay, but the alternative is just keeping the system we have that's driving us nuts forever and just accepting that. And we can't. We can't afford to. And in the spirit of that, I think there are so many big challenges like that where you are swimming upstream from all the systemic forces that are driving in a different direction, and it can seem impossible. But if your question is, should we try to do this impossible thing that would make our world better, my answer is yes. More is more. More people showing up to try and do impossible things together can make more of those things possible. And that's true of big time reforms to break us out of a two-party doom loop that's driving us crazy and forcing us to hate each other, which is not a system we are required to have. And that can be trying to work against the forces that have been closing local news outlets, local media outlets, and building something new together. That can also be part of that long-term change. And the one thing I can guarantee you is that if nobody comes together to do it, it will not get done by itself.
We've had another lead change in the questions. And again, it changed as I was reading it. This person said, many of my family members in rural West Virginia see this election as a spiritual war. By defeating Democrats and Republicans who are defending democracy, we're defeating Satan and demons. As a Christian with a different perspective, what advice do you have to engage with those promoting ideals of Christian nationalism? I'd like to start with you, Ted, if we can.
Yeah, what a big question. You know, I'm a believer of meeting people where they are, as long as my safety isn't in question or like my humanity. And so maybe this ties into the local journalism question. I can't remember which philosopher it was, Plato or Aristotle, one of those guys, says something like, once a society gets bigger than a city, it kind of gets hard to govern. And so city-states were sort of the optimal sort of size of a city. And the rationale was it was big enough to where you could be an individual, but small enough to where you still felt connected to the people around you. And once you go smaller than that, you feel a sort of personal connection, perhaps, or a more intimate connection. And once it gets larger, you feel less connected to the broader society. So local journalism helps keep us rooted in place. But democracy is a human-sized endeavor. It's people-sized. And so I think the local level is where you get to see people not with their Republican, Democrat label on, but as the person who has a kid on the same soccer team as yours, or the person that you see in the grocery store, every time you go through the express line or something. And so then, more times than not, people's politics don't trail them like a dust cloud, wherever they go. And we don't engage people saying, well, they look like they're on my politics, so I'm going to be kind to them, or they look like they practice a politics different from mine, so I'm going to be nasty with them. So my sort of approach to this, even with Christian nationalists or folks who think, maybe black people are not earning their keep in America, whatever it may be, is to not talk politics, but to just be people. And allow the personal interaction to be my kind of evangelizing for what an inclusive democracy should look like. And so I don't try to argue. I mean, like I said, I grew up in the black church, and I write in the book, the two things you don't question there are God and grown folk. So I'm not trying to change people's minds about what they believe. But if they believe something about me or people like me, and then I am a counter-argument to every stereotype they've embraced, I think I've done a service both for them, for myself, and for the country by just engaging them at the person level. This is a nonprofit space, so I won't get into like specific party examples, but I am guilty of avoiding people that when their politics are evident, I just don't want to engage. And one of the promises I've made myself since then, by 18 months, 2 years ago, is that I'm just not going to consider politics in my initial engagements with folks. And I think the more we tell local stories, the more we get to know the people that we live next to and around, and the people on the other side of town that we may not go to, that maybe we should be more proactive and engaging. I think the better off the country will be. And so, as was said, democracy is proactive. That also means like buying, if you want more local journalism, do you subscribe to the local paper? Do you watch the local news? Making your news consumption local will also, I think, help counter some of the national narratives that try to turn this into these very nasty binaries and then force us to pick a side on penalty of death or exclusion.
I just wanted to add one thing on that, because that's exactly right. I think we have become siloed in so many ways, but one of the things that's really interesting about elections and election administration is when I talked about those 775,000 people, they were almost equally represented across parties, across non-party affiliations. When you go to the elections office and you sit down and you're working and you're opening up vote-by-mail ballots or you're processing registration forms, it's a Democrat and a Republican sitting side by side. We'll say 8 hours a day, but it's more like 15, 16 hours a day. And by the first couple of days, when you bring in those folks that they're staunchly situated, and they believe, as some election officials have said, that they're going to find the body, right, in the office of all the crimes that are being committed. The first day, that's their posture. About a week in, they're swapping recipes, they're talking about their favorite knitting pattern, they're, exchanging golf swing tips. And it's that connection, because elections truly are a uniting exercise in this country in many ways, even though they want to tell us it's divisive. Because it is and it isn't. When you think about the Olympics, right? Everybody's got their team, or pick your sport, right? We're in the midst now of so many playoffs and all sorts of things. It's a unifying factor that brings us all together, no matter what team, what hat we're wearing. But we have to recognize the rules that are in place. And if we don't like those rules, we can change them, but we shouldn't be changing them just because we're afraid that our team is going to lose right before, or in the middle of the game, to keep that metaphor going.
Thank you very much. And we're right up against time. So I want to thank you all and close us with a quick quote from a hero of mine, the late Senator John McCain. When he was dying of cancer, he couldn't go to a foreign national security conference that he was receiving an award at. So he had his wife go, and he sent a letter. And I want to read from the closing of that because I find a lot of hope in it. He said, "I find myself more and more returning to the words of Marilyn Robinson, who wrote, 'It seemed to me sometimes that as though the Lord breathes on this poor gray ember of creation, and it turns to radiance for a moment or a year or the span of life. Wherever you turn your eyes, the world can shine like transfiguration. You don't have to bring a thing to it except a willingness to see. That is, to acknowledge that there is more beauty than our eyes can bear, that precious things have been put into our hands, and to do nothing to honor them is to do great harm.'" And the senator closes by saying, "I'm counting on all of you, my friends, to honor the precious, beautiful things that are still entrusted to our care. I'm counting on you to be brave. I'm counting on you to be useful. I'm counting on you to keep the faith and never give up, though the true radiance of our world may at times seem obscured. Though we will suffer adversity and setbacks and misfortune, never ever stop fighting for all that is good and just and decent about our world and each other." Thank you all, and thank you.